Hello, and welcome to part 2 of this presentation on the economics of religious philosophy, the self, the senses, the self, and happiness. If you are just seeing this and you have not seen part 1, I recommend you go to part 1. It's only 30 minutes long. Right, so let's go ahead and get started. We were talking last about intelligence. Okay, and before we actually start, I want to introduce you to my website, researching-religion.de. You can find the slides uploaded there, as well as the video. This video recording will be obviously there. Also, if you want to email me at j.michael.purdue@gmail.com, you're welcome to do that as well. So, okay, good. Let's go ahead and get back to the presentation. The mind, this is a subtle sense. The mind, we're talking about the subtle senses. The mind is characterized by determination, which is to accept something, in other words, and rejection. And the mind is constantly flickering between accepting and rejecting. The activities of the mind are thinking, feeling, and willing. So by thinking, feeling, and willing, we either accept something, we think about it, we desire it, or we reject something, right? We think about how we don't want it. But either of these, accepting or rejecting, or attachment and aversion, right? They develop, through these we develop attachment and aversion. But they're both sort of like different sides of the same coin, because they both encourage attachment, basically, or aversion, which is another form of attachment. When there is acceptance of something, the acts of thinking, feeling, and willing give birth to desire. So when we accept something, right, we want it through determination, right, mentioned here, determination. We develop desire for these things by thinking, feeling, and willing. And when there is rejection of something, the acts of thinking, feeling, and willing give birth to aversion. But as we were just saying, so basically aversion means that we don't want it. We are averse to it. But as we were just talking about, aversion is another form of attraction. So we really have to be careful when analyzing our own attachments and aversions, because the very things that we are averse to, we may actually be attached to indirectly, and just not wanting to acknowledge that within ourselves. So I let you think about that, but it can, we can talk about it later maybe. Again, if there's any questions about these slides, please ask. The mind is considered to be at the center of the senses. The mind is considered to be at the center of the senses. Right. So the different senses, which we will talk about later, basically make demands upon the mind. And through these different senses, the mind engages. But, we can talk about that later. But basically, we should understand this. The mind is at the center of the senses. The knowledge-acquiring senses. So this is the next of 3 category of senses. This is the knowledge-acquiring senses. So the 3 category of senses, these are the knowledge-acquiring senses that we will talk about now. And they are used to inform on the environment and the sense objects. They are 5 in number: auditory, tactile, visual, olfactory, and gustatory. And we're going to talk about all of them in more detail. The auditory, the sense of hearing or identifying sound. Sound communicates the variety of objects. Sound is the via medium for learning, insofar as lessons are communicated via spoken or written form. All right, so it looks like I have a double citation here, but that's not a big deal. The sense of touch, tactile, the sense of touch. The tactile sense gives information on 3-dimensional forms wherein there is texture. That means that it does not include holograms or similar forms, which are like a rainbow, for example. They appear to be there, but there is no dimension, no substance to them. outside of the visual outline. Texture is perceived in terms of dichotomies: hot or cold, smooth or rough, wet or dry. Right, so going back to this auditory sense, the sense of sound is actually very important, because through sound we learn. We learn by hearing. I mean, this is first class learning, is by hearing. Second class learning would be by witnessing how other people do something. And last class learning is by experiencing. Of course, we have to hear first, and then it's nice to see an example. And then the last time we want to experience. These are all different stages of learning as well. But in a very simple example, if you hear that it is wrong to steal, that's first class. If you see what happens to somebody when they are caught stealing, and then you learn not to steal, that's second class. And if you hear that it's not proper to steal, you see what happens to somebody who is stealing, and still you engage in theft, you're caught, but then you learn, that is last class learning. What is worse than that are people who hear, see, experience, but because of some addictive behavior or whatever reason, they still engage in theft afterwards, being caught. This is most unfortunate. But it can be resolved as well. We won't talk about that now, but moving right along. Auditory sense, very important for learning. Learning is very important, and through the auditory sense we learn. Visual, the sense of sight. Due to the variation in colors, the eyes are able to perceive different forms. Forms have characteristics determined by dimension, quality, and individuality. Gustatory, the sense of taste. The tongue is the instrument that informs on taste. Sweet, astringent, bitter, sour, salty, and pungent are examples of taste sensations. Moisture is necessary to perceive taste. Thus, the tongue is always moist. Olfactory, the sense of smell. Smells may be strong, acidic, offensive, mild, fragrant, etc. Okay, there are 5 active sense organs. Okay, so that was what we covered just now, were the knowledge acquiring senses. We acquire knowledge about objects within our environment. Through these senses, we see what it looks like, the dimension, the form. We smell, we taste, we touch, hot, cold, etc. Now we're talking about the active sense organs. They are the tongue for speaking, the legs for traveling, the arms and hands for working, the genitals for procreation, and the rectum for evacuation. Okay? Sense objects. The senses have their objects with which they engage and for which they make demands. The sense objects are scarce resources. All material resources, subtle or gross, are scarce. But we won't be talking too much more about the active sense organs, at least not now. But before we just breeze past them again, I think this is all pretty much self-explanatory. We use our legs for traveling, the genitals for procreation, the rectum for evacuation, the tongue is used for speaking, the arms and hands are used for working. Of course, we talked about how the tongue is also used for taste, right? Right. Let's go on now. For the knowledge acquiring senses, right? We're talking now about sense objects, right? The object of the senses. This is a very important topic because the senses are always coming into contact with their objects, and they're making demands so that they can become in contact with their objects, right? Okay. For knowledge acquiring senses, there are sound, taste, odor, color, and form. Right? So the sound is for the auditory sense, the taste for the tongue, odor, olfactory sense, color for the visual, and form for the tactile sense. The subtle senses, right? there are, remember the subtle senses we talked about, consciousness. This is in the last presentation. There's consciousness, ego, mind, and intelligence. So prestige, adoration, honor, and distinction are the sense objects for ego. Dominating through controlling, manipulating, and enjoying are the sense objects for consciousness. Thinking, feeling, and willing are the sense objects for the mind. And discernment is the sense object for intelligence. And that makes more sense if you look at the definition of intelligence, which is on the previous slide, our previous presentation. Now, the active sense organs engage their sense objects listed above, which we talked about in the previous slide. And they also, so like for example, the active sense organ for movement or traveling, right, or for the legs is to move and travel. The active sense organ of the legs, right? The object of that would be to travel, to move around, and so on and so forth. You can look it up if you want the slides later. You can take a look at them and see what that's all about. The sense organs engage, these active sense organs engage their sense objects, which we talked about, and they also assist the other sense in acquiring their sense objects. So, for example, you learn about a restaurant that has your favorite kind of food and you want to taste it. So your movement, your active sense organ of the legs, or movement, brings you there, right? And so on and so forth. So we're almost finished here. Now we're going to talk about the senses and the self. In the Vedanta Sutra, there is the following aphorism. Anando Mayabhyasat. Happiness is the nature of the spirit. The spirit is by nature full of happiness. Okay, the actor. So this is referencing the living entity, the essence of life, consciousness for the atheist, and the soul for the theist. The actor is constantly seeking gratification or happiness in some form or another. For example, some persons take pleasure in lamentation or suffering, right? So it's not always that people enjoy through traditional means. Not everybody enjoys a funny movie. Some people like movies that are very scary, for example. That's going on. Anyway, I like to laugh personally. I don't like to be afraid, so I don't like scary movies. What else is here? The senses are instruments for satisfying different bodily needs and wants. So there's a need to eat. There's a need to procreate. But also there's a want. And the difference between wanting and needing is that the wanting is when we do it simply to enjoy. But the need is when it has a result that maintains one's existence, or in preservation, or as we were talking about, procreation, right? But outside of that, what is not maintaining the self is actually considered to be want. What is beyond need is want. So in satisfying, and we'll talk about that more later, it's very important to understand these concepts, needing and wanting. Not all sense gratification, not all sensual activity falls under the category of satisfying needs, and not all falls under the category of satisfying wants. This is important to remember in light of the discussion, or the fact that sense objects are scarce resources. Okay, so we'll go into that later. In satisfying the needs and wants of the body, the actor experiences some happiness, some utility. Okay, so we get happiness by satisfying our sense organs, our different senses. Through consumption, through utility, all aspects of utility fall under the category are having in common this phenomena of the sense in contact with the sense object. Now, the actor hovers from one sense object to another in an attempt to find happiness by satisfying the needs and wants. Okay? So we're always kind of going between one sense object and another, trying to become happy, trying to stay happy, right? Because happiness is our constitutional position. It's a desire within the individual to find happiness and to be happy. Food must be consumed, and it is the sense of taste that sends a message to the mind informing on what kind of food should be consumed. Ego communicates a desire for honor, recognition, and distinction. The active sense of regeneration communicates a need for procreation. The active senses of movement and working communicate to the mind a need for traveling and engaging in work or activity for the self and for others. So if we're not engaging in work for the individual, we are engaging in work for others. That's important also to remember. The mind is also busy in concocting new methods of enjoyment and in remembering methods from the past. All of the senses are thus making demands for engagement in an effort to bring happiness to the actor. So we want to be happy, and we try to satisfy this need for happiness by engaging our senses in sensual activity. The gross senses and the mind are meant for working in tandem, working in cooperation with the intelligence, purposed as an authority to the mind. So the purpose of the intelligence is to direct the mind, to subjugate or to control, to direct the mind. The mind is considered to be at the center of the senses. It is engaged in determination and rejection of sense objects. It performs these functions by thinking, feeling, and willing. The mind, so we talked about that earlier, right? But the mind can be compared to a toddler, a 1 to 2 year old baby. If given a toy, a toddler will play with it and becomes attached to it and cries when the toy is taken away. So similarly, the mind, if we're giving the mind something to contemplate, we become attached to it in the mind. And when we don't get that which we want, we become frustrated. And of course, we will talk about that later. The intelligence is like a watchdog for the mind, a guard, so to speak, because the mind can be dangerous if left unattended, right? The idle mind is the devil's workshop. There's an expression. So the mind can cause problems because it becomes attached to things. And when the attachment is frustrated, there becomes anger. So it's important to use the intelligence to direct the thinking, feeling, and willing activities of the mind. And intelligence is in charge of discerning the potential utility from sense objects in 2 phases of time, present and future. This is very important. Utility in 2 phases of time. So the happiness we have now and the happiness, or better, the happiness or distress we have at the moment through engagement of sense objects, and the happiness or distress we will have in the future. The reaction from that engagement, the long-term effect. For example, we study in school, we develop human capital and job skills. And that's not very happy. It's a little bit of distress because we have to forego income. We have to forego other engagements which could bring happiness, sense enjoyment engagements. But in the long term, we have a better occupation and better facility for sensual enjoyment. That is the argument for higher education and developing human capital. But this can be applied to other activities as well. Intoxication. In the beginning, here's another one, not intoxication, but in the beginning, there is also an attraction between individuals. Not always a sexual attraction between individuals. So in the beginning, there is sexual attraction, and if unregulated, the 2 people come together, they engage in sexual activity, which in the beginning is very enjoyment. A lot of enjoyment is there. But in the long term, if the union wasn't properly planned out or thought about, if it was only based on sensual attraction, the long term can bring distress in so many varieties of ways I won't talk about. But so many distressful results can come from not planning out and thinking through decisions that involve sexual attraction. This is the way of harmony, the mind being controlled by the intelligence. That's the way of harmony. Consider the scenario wherein a sense object makes an appearance, thus prompting the mind and senses to engage. So the sense object, it appears in view, the attraction of the sense, whether it's the sense of touch, taste, smell, however it may be, procreation, whatever. It appears in view. Now, before the mind engages in meditation on the object, because we know from meditating on the object we develop attachment. But before we start this process of thinking, feeling, and willing, and developing attachment or aversion, the intelligence has to be consulted. Is this a good idea? Is the intelligence is the authority, and it instructs the mind in either practicing detachment by letting go and forgetting about the sense object in question, or in giving sanction for the mind to engage in contemplation. So that's very important, because if we don't use the mind or the intelligence to direct the mind, then we may be attached to so many things which will only bring us trouble, or only temporary happiness. Contemplation leads to attachment and strong desire. When desire is frustrated, an actor is not able to engage the sense with the desired sense object. The result of frustration is anger. So we become attached. We are not our attachments, for something we don't get, and therefore our desires are frustrated. Our attachments are frustrated, and then we become angry. So we want to avoid anger. It's not a very happy feeling. The system is perfect when all parts are properly employed and the intelligence is working nicely. It's perfect. It is often the case, however, that the intelligence is not employed and the mind is allowed to roam freely wherever it finds satisfaction. This leads to many unsatisfied desires, resulting in pent-up frustration. So again, the mind is allowed to roam wherever it wants, and a person naturally becomes frustrated and distracted, not very calm. And that's because the mind has developed attachment for many different things which are not satisfied. Okay. The system, we did this, right? All right. Even when the intelligence is employed, however, it may become compromised. So we're using our intelligence, but if we allow intelligence is less, if the intelligence becomes compromised. But how does intelligence become compromised? So this is not a question of academic learning, but it's more a question of intelligence. In other words, it's not less a question of academic learning, and more a question of being free from material attachments and biases, so that one can understand and analyze things in proper perspective. So again, we should understand intelligence is not a question of learning. It's not a question of algorithms that we learn or different sciences that we may learn. It's really a question of not allowing material attachments and biases to interfere with our decision making. That's really what it's a question of, because when we allow that to happen, we make bad decisions. We make decisions based on material attachments. It means that we are influenced by this desire to control situations and outcomes. And that can have bad effects, bad results. We can talk about that later, but for now, let's keep going with these fundamental principles here. Material attachments or biases blind the actor's intelligence, causing her to favor an object of the senses, in spite of the potential for adverse results that come therefrom. So, if we allow, like we were just saying, right, we allow our attachments to interfere with the intelligence, and we make decisions that aren't very healthy. Now, here we're talking about something a little bit different, the self as a servant, Sanatana Dharma. We talked about it earlier. The demands of the senses places the actor in an awkward position, okay, while aspiring for freedom and independence, because everybody wants to be free and independent. In the mission of self-satisfaction or utility maximization, the actor is compelled to submit to the demands of the bodily senses. So even though we want to be free and independent, the body makes demands on us. We have to. We are forced to eat. We are forced to engage in sensual activity of a variety of of different varieties. We are forced. We have no choice. So even though we want to be free and independent, our addictions force us to act a certain way. Our bodily needs force us to act a certain way. Desires can be so overwhelming and strong that they force us to act a certain way, but we are still held accountable for our actions. It would seem that the senses dictate how and where happiness is to be found. While at times the engagement of the sense satisfaction is willful, we're doing it voluntarily, at other times the actor is unable to resist the forces of the senses. So like I was just saying, sometimes we engage in activities even though it's against our will, but we are compelled by the bodily needs or by the desires that are overwhelming. In many ways, the actor is a servant of the senses. We are engaged in satisfying the different needs and wants that we've cultivated within our mind. Now, that's why it's important to use intelligence to direct these. Okay, where were we? In many ways, the actor is a servant of the senses. When they are not serving their own senses, they are busy in serving the senses of someone else. Thus, the engagement of service is unavoidable. It is even intrinsic to the human condition. It is her sanatana dharma, right? So sense activity, it means that we are servants. We can't avoid it. As much as an individual wants to be independent and free, they have to serve. They have to serve themselves, and indirectly they serve others as well, directly or indirectly. So this is something that's very important to understand. It's relevant later on as well. Okay, what motivates sensual activity? And this is the last topic. Every actor must experience some happiness or utility to stay engaged in service. For example, parents must tolerate the burden of parenthood. But in doing so, they enjoy some utility from the relationship with their children. This is important also. All the services we perform, we get some pleasure from them. That's why we engage in them, right? Of course, sometimes we're forced to do it. That's another question. But even if we are forced to do something, still there's something there. There's some attachment that's there forcing us to do it. So there's somehow we enjoy that activity. And that's what drives us on and on. Similarly, the utility derived from engaging the senses motivates an actor to continue the endeavor required to engage them. So endeavor must be there, as sense objects are scarce resources that require work to secure. This is important. We have to work hard to secure sense objects, and in order to enjoy, right? So that's why there is some endeavor. The scarcity of sense objects and the endeavor to secure them results in conflict, even on the individual level. For example, it can be seen that an actor will eat while talking, indicating a competition between the knowledge-acquiring sense of taste and the active sense organ for speaking. So this is very interesting, and it should be pointed out. We have to kind of think about it. It requires, like I said, self-introspection. Think about how sometimes we feel compelled, we're so much in a hurry that we eat quickly while we're going somewhere. We are not able to calm down enough to go where we need to be and then eat, right? Or to eat in a clean environment, for example. This is because the mind is pushing the demands. It makes demands, the eating demand, the movement demand, the mind's demand. We're making demands on us to go places and do things to in such a way that they come in conflict with each other. Multitasking, right? Because we're too busy to just do one thing at a time. The mind is making these demands. It's forcing us to engage in different activities, sensual activities, which come in conflict with each other, like speaking and eating. Okay, so that's it for today. That was the presentation I wanted to give you. It took about an hour, 30 minutes, 2 sides, 2 points, or 2 presentations, part 1 and 2. If you have any questions, please direct your questions to my email address. Wrong one. Where is that? Here it is, right here. Here's my website. And right here, you'll find my email address. So you can go to the website and look at other research that I've done. You can download. You can look at my CV. I'm looking for a job. I would like to complete my PhD. So if you know somebody, or maybe that's not even relevant, but if this interesting research is something you are in a position to facilitate its further development, please contact me. Also, you can have questions about the material. You can send me an email. Thank you very much and have a nice day.